Everyone, it is the Explainer of Mysteries here, and today we're going to be talking about Saturn return. We're actually going to be going more in some depths about it and about the planet Saturn, blah, from the concept of karma. So, yes, Saturn does represent karma in a way, but on a grander and more just kind of a large scale level, Saturn represents boundaries and restrictions. Saturn represents the physical world. And in order for the physical things to exist, there has to be some kind of boundary. There has to be some kind of definition. And so, because of that, Saturn also represents karma because everything happens in the physical world happens in cycles. In fact, everything physical, spiritual, celestial, and even, sublunary, terrestrial, and infernal, that is all, everything operates in cycles. And so Saturn represents all those things. Now, with the concept of karma, that karma can come from past lives. That karma can come even from the moment you were born. That's going to include your past lives from the moment you were born all the way up until this point in your life, and everything up until Saturn return. And this isn't just with Saturn returns. This can be really any transits with Saturn, whether that's, another planet transiting your Saturn. That could be Saturn making a square or opposition to your natal Saturn. That's a big one. And as far as, you know, the concept of karma, it's not like justice as in our idea of justice. It's not good or evil, it's not fairness, it's not necessarily reward or punishment. And so a lot of people think that somehow Saturn return it's only going to evaluate everything that happens from, like, when you were 18 or 20 years old up until, you know your Saturn return time. That's not the case. Yes, Saturn is going to judge you and, build up your karma from the moment you were born, even your previous life. And I know that doesn't sound fair to, most, normal, like, on the physical world, because we think, well, they're just a child. They're not, like, how can they be responsible and be held accountable if they're just a child? They don't know any better. They didn't do anything wrong. And that's simply not the case. That's not how Saturn works. That's not how the spiritual realm works. That's not how the higher realms work. And so, if we look at the planet Saturn, you know, with the karma, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to reward or punish you for whatever happened prior to Saturn return. It's more of a reevaluation. So specifically, if you had some kind of, I guess, crutch that you used, or some kind of, advantage in life that you kind of just skated by on. You didn't really have to work hard or, really do much. It was just kind of guaranteed for you. And you sort of just skated by on it, and you just sort of, took maximum advantage of it. Or even worse, you sort of abused, that kind of, I guess, whatever blessings that you were given in life. So if that's, you have really good social skills, and you sort of use your social skills to, take advantage of people or do them dirty, or, think you're just going to get away with stuff because, you're good at talking, you're good at relating to people, you're good at, sort of seducing them or manipulating them. if you were, naturally good looking, like you've just been super attractive, all your life up until this point, everyone just kind of gave free compliments to you, everyone treated you well, you were just kind of the star of the show, and you would always get, sort of this positive attention. Saturn is going to slowly strip that away. You can't really just rely on that, or it's going to throw something in your way where you can't use this to just get yourself out of trouble. So if, say, you're really good looking and then you get into some, big financial trouble, you may not have the option of just, getting someone to bail you out because you were super good looking. This can be, also with, natural talents. A lot of people just kind of bank on their natural talents and they don't really bother to look outside of it. You know, this can go with, if you just happen to make a lot of money, like you get a lot of money from your family, or you're just really well connected, or you sort of just manage to get some easy and fast money without anything, really not contributing much. You're going to be forced to reevaluate that. Likewise, this isn't always the case, but Saturn can also, Saturn return can actually bring a lot of benefits into your life. However, it is going to be based on perspective. So, with me, prior to my Saturn return, I would say that I was a pretty physically active guy. I was, decently athletic. Like, I wasn't super muscular, super buff. In fact, I was really skinny, but I had a lot of endurance. And so there would be times where I wouldn't even bother, like, even buying a car or even needing a car because, for me, I was sort of a natural walker. I could walk, I could run. It was pretty easy for me. I could do it pretty fast. And, I mean, obviously it's not as convenient as just driving, but, it was a lot easier, compared to a lot of people because, they were kind of, a lot slower. Also, during my Jupiter return, around that time, I made tons and tons of money. I was doing really well, and like I was actually in much better shape during my Jupiter return than any time in my life. Like I was going to the gym. Like I was actually pretty decent looking. Like I was definitely more muscular. Really filled out my skeleton, my frame. Jupiter has to do with expansion and good fortune, so a lot of those things happened in my life, and I was definitely getting a lot more positive attention from people. Like before, they would just kind of mention like, "Oh yeah, you're a pretty intelligent guy," which it's something that I just took for granted. I didn't really care about being super intelligent or nerdy. I wanted to have like the life of the party, and I wanted to like look good and like impress people and have everyone think that I'm this like super cool and like I guess attractive guy. I wanted to be like that life. I didn't care about, studying hard or going to school or really using a lot of my other natural talents. That's another thing that Saturn can bring, is that if you've sort of taken a lot of your other things for granted, Saturn may put you in a position where you really have to reevaluate that. Same thing is, there was a time, there were actually quite a few, prior to my Saturn return, I was doing like really well in life. I was like, fairly good looking. People would always mention that I'm tall, like, oh, you're tall, you're handsome, you're a cute guy, you're a good looking guy, and I kind of took advantage of that. I took like big advantage of that, and when Saturn return came, my health took a hit. Also I had just had like a really good immune system. I'm not trying to brag about myself, but I'm telling you about a lot of the benefits that I had prior to my Saturn return, And when Saturn return came around, I was really forced to reevaluate things. I couldn't just rely on these old, these privileges that I was given and that I sort of took for granted for so many years in my life. Saturn was going to do that. And so when I started having health problems and, which led to money problems and just all kinds of things further on down the line, you know, I was, that's really putting things into perspective for you. You really have to dig deep down and, you're going to have to pick and choose. You're going to have to, make some really hard sacrifices. You're going to have to, do a lot of things. And also, because my 12th house is empty, as in like there's no planets in my 12th house. Like there's no, north node or anything there. I mean, that's my 12th house is pretty much like there's nothing there natally. And so my Saturn return actually started a little earlier than, you know, really than when it actually hit my first house because my 12th house was empty. And so when Saturn was transiting through my 12th house, it really, really intensified it. Like it got super intense, and the intensity was already coming on during that point. Of course, once it, passed through my natal Saturn and everything else, the situation got better, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go back to being young. It's not like, if you had a lot of money prior to Saturn returns, Saturn comes around, and then you're just going to go back to having tons of money. It's not like, if you were, like in my case, kind of pretty, physically active, fairly athletic, and then you get health problems, and then after Saturn return, you'll just go back to your old self. That's not really going to happen. I'm sure there are cases where that happens, but for the most part, it's not going to be the case. Now, that's sort of it on my story with Saturn return. I know I've done a lot of videos on it, but I think it's something that's way overlooked and a lot of just misunderstood stuff. I hope that helps everyone. Take care.